and welcome to this, our second edition of CTGo with APCSS. Today is the 12th of May. I'm here in Honolulu talking to our guest in distant Singapore, both working out of our homes and hoping that the quality of our audio will be clear and free of glitches, almost as it would be if we were recording in a studio. I'm Shyam Tekwani, professor at the DKI APCSS, who most of you may know from the CSRT courses. And I'm your host now for this conversation that will examine the kind of effects that the coronavirus is likely having upon terrorism and counterterrorism in the Indo-Pacific region. The virus crisis has understandably been dominating the political and economic conversations over the last few months and will continue to do so for some time yet, with everybody running out of superlatives to describe the historic nature of the impact. Yet, there are a number of other significant events and trends that will have a big impact on our lives in the months and perhaps years to come. We are here to talk about one such issue, which for a change is not dominating the news cycle. I'm talking about terrorism. The virus has created its own form of terror. It has distorted daily life, paralyzed the economy, and divided people one from another. It has increased fear of the stranger, of the foreigner, and of the unknown. Every major catastrophic event, like this pandemic, for instance, gives rise to several narratives, often those that appeal to our darker instincts. Some of these narratives are born of ignorance, some prejudice, some speculation, but mostly from something deadlier than the virus, and that is your overnight expert. So, to sift the hyperbole from ground realities, we have with us today Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna. Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna is Associate Dean for Policy Studies, head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research, and the third hat he wears is that of Research Advisor to the National Security Studies Program, all three at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So, Kumar, welcome to the conversation here.
Oh, hi, Shyam. Good to be here.
Glad to have you on board, Kumar. Thanks for taking some time off for this. So, without taking further time, I'd like to jump into the first question that's uppermost in my mind. And so, Kumar, would you say that the virus has generated almost the same fear and anxiety caused by terrorism? Are there any differences? Is there any value in comparing the fear and anxiety generated by terrorism or the virus?
Shyam, I guess that's a good way to start. I'll say that at one level, both these threats, right, transnational terrorism, as well as this latest COVID-19 pandemic, they have generated levels of fear and anxiety in populations in our region, in the Indo-Pacific region, and elsewhere. I would say that I have to say that certainly as far as Singapore is concerned, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a lot more up close and personal than the terrorist threat. We were never actually attacked in the post-9/11 era. We had a few close calls, particularly in December 2001, just a few months after the September 11 terrorist attacks in the US. We had a joint Al-Qaeda, Jamaah Islamiyah terror plot in Singapore, targeting Western embassies and other targets as well as Singapore government targets. And it took the end of 2001 and part of 2002 before the authorities in Singapore were able to quash the Jamaah Islamiyah terror plot. Jamaah Islamiyah is an Indonesian-based but transnational terror network, which is radical Islamist in its ideological orientations, similar to Al-Qaeda. similar in many ways to the current ISIS threat as well. But in the case of the JI threat, we were never, as I mentioned, never actually attacked. There was no successful terrorist attack. So although there were certainly anxieties and fear to some extent back in 2001, 2002, it is nothing really compared to the anxiety and levels of concern now because, as we know, Singapore currently has the highest rate of COVID-19 infections in Southeast Asia, mainly due to the problem in our foreign worker dormitories. I have to say that the government is working hard to get it under control, and there are signs, thankfully, that it is slowly stabilizing. But the levels of anxiety in the population, I would have to say, is as far as I can recall, a lot higher than was the case back in 2001, 2002 with the terrorism threat. Having said that, I don't really think there is a awful lot to be gained in terms of analysis from comparing the pandemic threat to terrorism threat. I mean, in some ways, you're comparing apples and oranges.
Mm-hmm.
But what is common is that ultimately, both kinds of threats and other kinds of threats do have implications for the level of preparedness of the population, whether in Singapore, Southeast Asia, or in the wider Indo-Pacific. The degree to which the government of the day in any of these countries can respond to the threat in a decisive manner, in a coordinated whole of government and even a whole society manner is very important. And just as for terrorism, there is a need for cross-border transnational cooperation among regional governments because just like the terror threat, the COVID-19 pandemic respects no borders. So in these ways, there is a level of comparisons that can be made. But beyond that, we are dealing with apples and oranges. So I think we should mentally attune ourselves to that. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That brings me to the next. It just leads me to another question, which is basically, are we seeing the level of cooperation necessary to deal with the virus? The level of cooperation, do we see the same kind of cooperation when we deal with terrorism in the region?
It's been almost 20 years since the September 11 attacks and the emergence of the transnational terrorist threat in Southeast Asia. And in that time, a lot has been done within the ASEAN community, Association of Southeast Asian Nations community involving the 10 nations in Southeast Asia to sort of forge many levels and many types of collaboration in counterterrorism. And many of these types of collaboration are also occurring at the bilateral level. For example, there's very strong ties between Singapore and Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia. Trilateral level between Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia on terrorism cases. Between Malaysia and Philippines in dealing with the tri-border maritime region in the Sulu Sea, for example. At ASEAN level, there have been many ASEAN conventions to forge agreements to share information and exchange ideas to combat transnational terrorism. So a lot has been going on since September 11, especially since the Bali attacks by JI in October 2002, which really woke up the region to the real and present danger of the transnational terrorist threat.
So do you think... Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Thus far, as far as the COVID-19 situation is concerned, right now, it's still early days. I think a lot of the governments in the region are focused on getting the situation within their national borders under control first. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there is, of course, been a fair bit of communication and dialogue going on between the governments, because at some point, there is going to be a need to coordinate the reopening of the air routes and the border crossings within the region, because the economies need to restart and the economies need to reconnect again as well. So the flow of goods and persons and services, which has been understandably truncated during this time, will need to be gradually, restarted in a calibrated fashion. But at this point in time, I think a lot of the countries are still trying to focus on getting flattening the curve, the COVID-19 infections within their respective national jurisdictions, which is quite a similar case as you can see around the world.
So now, one often hears that terrorists are making use of this pandemic to their advantage. I mean, and so by extension, I would imagine that if that were the case indeed, there would have been a far more number of attacks in the region if that were true. My question to you is, if that's not true, is it likely that the virus has scared away the terrorists as much as it has the rest of the population? And if there are not many attacks happening now, with the terrorists not taking advantage of the situation, why is that so?
Well, actually, I have to say, Shyam, that I would say that at the beginning of the year, when it was first discovered that we have this pandemic situation developing, COVID-19, there was not much activity on the terrorist front, certainly in Southeast Asia. But I have to say that since April beginning, you can see that very discernibly an uptick in terrorist attacks in some places. For example, just in April, mid-April just about last month, there was an attack by the Abu Sayyaf group on the Armed Forces of the Philippines unit, and about 11 AFP soldiers were killed. And this was, according to the Philippine officials, the most significant and deadliest attack since the January 2019 church bombings in Jolo in the southern Philippines, which was also an Abu Sayyaf operation, although the two suicide bombers involved in that attack on the churches in January 2019 were from the Jamaah Ansarut Daulah group in Indonesia. So there was some transnational element there in cooperation between the terrorist groups. So just last month, we had this incident in the Philippines, southern Philippines, which was a very significant incident. And also last month in Central Sulawesi in Indonesia, Eastern Indonesia, there was an attack by the East Indonesian Mujahideen, or according to the Indonesian acronym MIT, on Indonesian police as well. And although the two perpetrators were MIT perpetrators were killed, there have been videos circulating in that part of Indonesia extolling supporters to rise up and take advantage of the fact that the COVID-19 situation has distracted the security forces. So you can see a dynamic right now emerging where transnational terrorist groups like MIT. I mean, MIT is an Indonesian group with international links, similar for Abu Sayyaf. You can see that they are trying to take advantage of the COVID-19 situation, the fact that the security forces now have to devote some of their resources to dealing with the COVID-19 situation. And these groups are beginning to exploit that, and in fact calling on their supporters to exploit this as well, this situation as well. So you do see this development occurring.
Yeah, but the two incidents you described, both in the Philippines and Indonesia, I mean, if you looked at what happens in those parts of the country over the years, it's not unusual for an attack of this scope to happen at least once a year. Admittedly, I mean, just because one group is invoking COVID as an opportunity does it really make it look like it's because of COVID these attacks happen, or because the attacks would have anyway happened? They tend to happen all through the year, or not all through the year, but almost every year with frequency. So I think the question here is, can we really determine that these attacks and COVID are correlated?
Well, that's a good question, Shyam. Well, certainly going by what the militants in Indonesia themselves are saying, that they are actually using the COVID-19 outbreak to say that this is an indication that, well, in their view, their interpretation, God is on their side and they are going to win the war, right? So this is what they themselves are saying, certainly at least in Indonesia. So so this is actually quite significant, because if they use this sort of discourse, it can actually have a impact on recruitment, and this could actually help such groups regenerate. I mean, groups like Abu Sayyaf and other similar groups in the Philippines, and groups like MIT have been heavily impacted by intense security force pressure in recent years. So there's a real dire need for them to regenerate and recruit. So this COVID-19 situation has been a boon for them, both in terms of operational matters, because the security forces have been distracted, but also I would argue ideologically as well, because they can weave this incident into their narratives and add some so-called authenticity to the narratives, and make them perhaps even more credible amongst vulnerable constituencies in these countries.
That's interesting you bring this up, because last week the European Union's counterterrorism chief, he put out a warning that the virus pandemic is fueling extremism on the far right and far left in Europe, and giving terrorist organizations, elsewhere, is giving them cover to either regain influence or to further consolidate their hold. We also hear of various groups across all religions, actually, promoting an explanation for the virus in line with apocalyptic narratives. It's as if it's a manifestation of God's anger. So is that something we're seeing in the recruitment strategies that you just referred to?
Yes, you definitely can see that in Southeast Asia, in as I mentioned, the MIT case in Central Sulawesi. And in fact, because of social media, many of for example, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS narratives, for example, the Al-Naba online portal of ISIS has actually referred to the COVID-19 outbreak in China as an example of God's retribution against China for their treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population in Xinjiang. Right? And also, when the COVID-19 epidemic hit Iran, ISIS used this development to sort of put out the narrative that God was punishing the Shia for their apostasy. So this COVID-19 pandemic has been a boon to these transnational terrorist groups in two ways. One is operationally, because resources from governments have to be diverted to deal with the threat, and ideologically, because it really feeds and strengthens their narrative that God is punishing the infidels. So that is one aspect on the Islamic side. On the far right side, I'm glad you brought that up, because for many years now, we've seen the phenomenon of reciprocal radicalization, where the far right is emerging and radicalizing in response to what the Islamists do, and vice versa. We do know that in the Western world, many of these far right white supremacist groups are believers in this operational philosophy of accelerationism, i.e., they feel that they must bring about the collapse of society through active measures, right? through attacks in order to destabilize societies and governments and bring them down and put up white ethno-states in their place. Right.
Mhm.
So groups like the Atom Weapon Division in the US, the base, and other similar groups around the world are believers in this accelerationist philosophy. And the thing which worries me as an analyst is their followers are actually trying to carry out the injunctions by some of these white supremacist groups to weaponize COVID-19. So, for example, as we know, there have been calls in the UK and the US to sort of like those who are infected to sort of deliberately target law enforcement and target vulnerable communities, public spaces where vulnerable communities who are non-white congregate and just smear their saliva or on areas where public spaces where the target communities congregate. So this is another example of how terrorist groups have weaponized COVID-19, particularly on the far right. So this is a trend which we should be worried about and pay policy attention to.
So, what about reports that we hear of terrorists and militant groups joining the fight against the virus? Now, for example, in Lebanon, Hezbollah is said to have mobilized 1,500 doctors, 3,000 nurses and paramedics, and 20,000 activists to fight the virus. In Afghanistan, the Taliban is distributing videos on disinfection and mobilizing its fighters to hand out face masks and soaps. In Libya, rebels have imposed a curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. in an attempt to curb the spread of the virus. Hamas, they're reported to be building 2 large quarantine facilities. And a very recent edition of ISIS newsletter, it includes a number of directives to address the disease. Now, clearly, we have many violent groups playing humanitarians, mobilizing people to protect their citizens from this disease, where the government's power is either weak or non-existent, right? So should this be a cause for concern? Could this be another, do you think, a part of the ideology or part of their tactic to recruit?
Absolutely. It's part of the playbook. For a long time, we've known that Islamist entities like Hamas, Hezbollah, certainly Taliban, of course ISIS in the Middle East. They are trying to create states. They want to create functioning Islamic theocratic states in their regions of control. And in order to do that, they can't just rely on coercion. Coercion is a big part of the playbook, but if they can also gain legitimacy with the populations under their control by providing services, public health services and welfare services, this will help strengthen their narratives that they are actually doing God's will, so to speak, by acting as functional governing administration. So this is actually a cause of concern, as you pointed out. If governments are unable to provide effective governance, they can't deliver the public goods of security, welfare, public health, justice in countries which are failing states. It's going to be an opportunity for such groups to sink their roots deeper in and develop relatively resilient governance and cohesive structures that will be that much harder to dislodge. So the political problem the security problem will be compounded by a political problem as well. How if these groups are successful in developing effective administrations in the face of the pandemic, this will essentially strengthen the narrative that they are legitimate and God is with them. and this will have implications for the overall campaign against such radical Islamist entities.
Okay. So in your assessment, what do you think are the things that need to still be on the radar of counterterrorism practitioners in the region? I mean, I know everybody's busy fighting the virus, everybody's busy doing many of the just surviving. But as counterterrorism practitioners, what are some of the things we cannot afford to let off our radar screens?
Well, certainly in the short term, I think the counterterrorism community should be aware that the groups, transnational terrorist groups in the region, are fully aware that the attention of security forces and governments has been distracted, and they are going to exploit it. And so there must be this awareness. There has to be risk management done of potential areas of vulnerability, being driven by the fact that extremist groups are going to exploit the distraction of security forces and governments during this time. Secondly, there's also a need for enhanced counter narratives, counter ideological efforts, campaigns to counteract the increased intensity of extremist ideologues who are claiming COVID-19 as an indication of God's favor upon their respective enterprises. So there needs to be counter narratives against that to show that no, I mean that's nonsense. COVID-19 has nothing to do with God showing favor to these extremist groups. So that is a role for religious scholars in the region, and not just Southeast Asia but elsewhere. So there's
So Kumar, are we seeing any of this counter narrative anywhere in the world, anywhere that you have seen it so far?
Not yet, not in a big way. So that's why I feel that there's a real need to be proactive and take some action on this.
Okay.
So that's so the ideological front, the operational front, and also especially one going forward. I think we have to be aware that there's a lot of learning between, for example, the far right and the radical Islamists, the violent Islamists. So just as the far right militants have copied some of the methodologies of the likes of ISIS, for example, the use of vehicle attacks, there is, to me, a possibility that there may be an uptick of the violent Islamists taking a leaf out of the accelerationist operational ideas of the far right as well, because everything's online, right? So they read one another and they respond to one another. So I think we should pay attention to the ways in which both the far right, especially, and the Islamists will learn from one another in terms of exploiting the COVID-19 crisis for their respective programs.
Okay. Well, Kumar, before I let you go, I'd like you to quickly take a peek at your crystal ball and let me know, will terrorism be the same after we are back to what we would call our normal lives?
Well, I believe that, first of all, I'm not very sure whether we'll ever get back to what it was pre-COVID-19. I think as many observers and analysts have pointed out, there'll be a new normal in terms of safe management, safe distancing practices. We'll all have to get used to in our daily lives as well as in our overseas travel, for example. And in terms of the fight against terrorism, my own view is that it will still be there. It's still going to be a concern because the underlying factors that give rise to transnational terrorism are still there. The COVID-19 situation is in many ways part of the enabling environment which extremist ideologues on all sides can use to strengthen their recruitment and regenerative recruitment strategy. So COVID-19 in many ways will be a boon for the transnational terrorist groups of all kinds. So governments will have to pay attention to this, and unfortunately it's going to be part of the new normal.
So that means more work for us counterterrorism practitioners in the
Very
community.
much so.
Yeah. Well, Kumar, it was wonderful having you in this conversation, and certainly look forward to having you back again sometime soon. But thank you so much, and take care, and we'll be in touch again.
Thanks, Shyam.
Okay, thanks
very much. Take care.
Yeah. You too. Thank you for listening to this second edition of CTGo with APCSS with Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna. If you liked our podcast and want to know more, please stay tuned with the CTGo group, or please leave us your comments, suggestions, and questions, if any, and we'll let you know when to join us again. Thank you very much. Goodbye.